Shawn, welcome. Let's talk about how to move your business to another state. You might be wanting to get away from California with the AB5 stuff. We've talked a lot about AB5 here on the channel lately. Maybe you want to just get away from a higher tax jurisdiction and move to a lower tax jurisdiction. Maybe you've relocated yourself, your family. Maybe you've moved from one part of the country to another. At one point, I was doing a lot of California to Texas relocations. People were leaving California, moving to Texas, taxation, lower costs of property, generally a better regulatory climate, right? There could be a lot of different reasons you want to do it, but today we're going to jump into how do you get that business from one state to another state. We'll talk a little bit about the how-to, but we'll also talk about some of the limitations, right? This is not a magic bullet in all cases. There are limits to what happens when you move your business from one state to another state. So maybe part of a broader strategy to get to a better place. You need to be realistic about what you can accomplish with it and how that's going to look and the work that's required with it. But it may be part of a broader strategy to get you where you want to be. So let's jump into it. As always, we'll be talking about legal issues. This is not legal advice. That will be tailored to your situation. This is just an educational entertainment product, also not financial investment advice. Consult your advisors about your situation. All right, there are a few ways to move your business from one location to another. And we're going to break those down here throughout the video here. We'll teach you the different ways that you can look at. Some of it depends on the state laws available. Some of it depends on maybe things that you've entered into, contracts, agreements, other things. So you're going to want to look at that totality of where you're at and what that looks like. So there are several ways to do this. Before I get into the technicalities, and I know you guys are interested in that, I do want to be realistic about what this won't do. Just moving your business from one state to another, if you continue to operate the same way, isn't necessarily going to eliminate state income tax, right? A lot of people have that mistake. They think, okay, well, if I move out of California, I move to a no or low income tax state, I'll be paying a lot less state taxes. Maybe yes, maybe no. But a lot of that is based on where your operations are, where your employees are. So it's going, and where your assets are deployed. That's the standard kind of test that state tax authorities use: assets, employees, and income. So just moving the location of headquarters or the state that you're formed in, legally moving to another state, is not necessarily going to do that. Now, if you start pairing that with an actual physical move, you may end up in a much more desirable place. And a lot of people may be thinking about AB5 with the California trucking, where AB5 is the bill that was passed by the California Assembly, which makes it really difficult for businesses to have independent contractors in California. Basically, everybody's getting classified as an employee with some exceptions. Hitting the trucking industry real hard because there was a delay on implementation in the trucking industry, but now that delay has been lifted by the courts. So if you're thinking about, California and avoiding some of the AB5 regulations, one thing we discussed on the video recently here on the channel, and you can go check that video out if you haven't seen it yet, but one thing we said about AB5 was, moving your operations out of California and relocating your business out of California might be a way to avoid the regulation. As we see what happens, how the law's been passed, now we're waiting to see the California regulations and how it's implemented and what they can do under the Constitution. We expect that litigation. So it may fix those issues, but let's say you are a California LLC now, you move your LLC to Nevada, but you still have, a house in California, you're keeping your truck in California when it's not in use, you're living in California. Maybe you are working on doing your booking of your next routes from California. You've just put yourself in a real box here because California's got so many connections there. What you really want to do is break those connections. Now, you move yourself across the border, you're in Nevada, you're in Washington State, you have your house there, you do your you do a lot of your work there, you line up your next routes from Washington or Nevada, you keep your truck in Nevada or Washington when it's not in use, and then you go into California, deliver stuff, and leave. Now California, from a constitutional standpoint, is really going to have to stretch to do that employment relationship and to regulate that employment relationship. So we're just being realistic, right? You see, you have to break the connections with that state in more ways than one. If you leave all your employees and all your assets in the state you're trying to leave, you're still going to be regulated by that state for all those employment relationships, all the income off that business, et cetera, et cetera. So just physically changing your state of formation, state of incorporation is not going to fix this. All right, let's jump into the meat of it. Here's several different options for it. Number one, start a new business and close the old. I've seen people done it. This is probably, for most people, the worst option. It is an option, but we start with it because this is where logically a lot of people jump. I have a California LLC, let's say. I want to be in Florida. I form a new Florida LLC, maybe the same name, maybe a different name. Generally, for state law purposes, you can use the same name. So you might have XYZ LLC, a California LLC, filed with the California secretary, and then you come to Florida and you say, I want to be XYZ LLC. You could actually generally file that XYZ LLC because the state databases are usually within the state. California and Florida are not going to cross-check the names of the corporations across the states, which means you could theoretically have, use the same name in two states, but they would be two separate legal entities. The problem with this is now what happens to your assets, what happens to your operations, what happens to all the contracts, what happens to the bank accounts. If when you just set up another entity in another state, same name, different name, somehow everything's got to be transferred, and that's going to be a process, and that's going to be a lot of work, and generally not efficient. Could be very inefficient, and you could end up hitting issues with paying sales tax. Let's say your truck, your trailer. You are now in California under a California LLC. You set up a brand new Florida LLC. You transfer everything to the Florida LLC. And guess what? They want sales tax on it, depending on which state you're registering in, et cetera. So starting a new business and then eventually closing the old business is an option for getting from one state to another, but it's probably the least artful option and probably the most cumbersome. But maybe necessary in some cases, and it's certainly something to consider. Depending on tax attributes, et cetera, in some limited cases, it might make sense to close down old business, start a new business. May benefit you from a tax standpoint, but a lot to think about there. And so you need to look at your particular situation. The big one now, number two, I've listed this as number two, but this is probably the number one way to do it, if available. Not every state has a conversion statute, but many states now do. And what you really need is you need both states in play to have a conversion statute, right? Generally, most companies are formed under the laws of one state. We do see some very limited exceptions where states are formed under laws of more than one state. That's not very common at all, very, very rare. So what you would do is you would look at the two states in play, the state you're leaving from and the state you're going to, and you would confirm that they both have conversion statutes. And what these statutes generally say is when you comply with these certain formalities, you essentially move your entity from one state to another legally. And you would file in both states. You would file in the state you're going to. You would file in the state you were coming from. You would comply with the law in both states to do this process. You would have to carefully time your filings to be filed at the same time. One issue here, a sub-issue with this, is rejection of filings, right? If you're going to file a paperwork in one state one that you're leaving and file paperwork in state two, the state you're coming to, you want them to match as much as they can, and then you also want them to be filed at the same time, right? You don't want a logical disconnect, right? You don't want to be in both states at the same time. You want those filings to be at the exact same time, so you have to think about that. So the conversion process could move you from one state to another. There's some technical paperwork to be done, but it's probably the cleanest, and it probably clears up some of the other issues, ancillary issues that we'll be talking about towards the end of the video. So stay tuned for that. These issues apply regardless, but conversion helps probably the most with some of these ancillary issues. Another way to do this is through a merger. This is probably the old way to do it. May still be necessary if you have multiple states involved and one of them doesn't have a conversion statute, what you can generally do is set up a merger. You would set up the new company in the new state, file, and then at some point you would merge the old company into the new company. You would file a merger. And by operational law, when you do that merger, all the assets and activities of the old company generally transfer to the new company. You'll have to look at some of the ancillary issues we're going to talk about, but this is the way people used to do it before the conversion statutes became very common, is you would just do a merger to move a company from one state to another. Still an option, still necessary in some states because you will hit states that do not have a conversion statute. You might be stuck to get in and out of states to do a merger as an option. Another way to do it is an asset transfer, where you actually just transfer the assets of the business to a new business. So we talked about the close down and restart. That would presumably involve a sale of the assets, or closing down the old accounts receivable, etc., and starting new accounts receivable, new bank accounts for the new entity. Another way to do this is to transfer the assets from one entity to another. So you would do some kind of blanket bill of sale or other transaction moving the assets from the one entity to the other. Again, generally not a desirable way to do it, generally a complex way to do it, generally leaves a lot of open issues. But it does at least give you some more continuity than the close down, restart that we opened the show with. Maybe might be necessary in some limited cases where you have issues structuring a merger or conversion for some odd reason. Maybe you have a contractual provision or other things that block you. So it's another option on the table, right? So we've given you 4 main options. There are some ancillary issues that come up in moving your business from one state to another. Let's jump into that. You've got to look at the laws of both states, right? You got to make sure you understand what's going to happen as you do this. Generally, the conversion statutes say that the converted business is considered a continuation of the other business for legal purposes in the new state. You got to understand that on both sides. You got to get the filings coordinated. And again, you may want to do what they call pre-filings. You may want to prepare your documents for your conversion or merger or whatever other transaction you might have. You might want to clear it with the state first to make sure they're going to accept it for filing, and then file it at a specific time. That avoids a lot of the uncertainty. And your lawyer can run you through the pre-filing and clearance process if necessary. The other thing you need to remember, too, with all this is ancillary agreements and ancillary filings. You're probably going to have an unemployment tax account in various states, one or more states. You may have a business licenses in one or more states. Obviously, any registration of vehicles, etc. And you may have contracts and other agreements, which are all keyed into your entity in whatever state you're leaving. And when you come to the new state, you will need to work with various jurisdictions to transfer those accounts. And this can be a lot of paperwork, time-consuming, maybe difficult to get them to update their computer system, but you can transfer the account from one to the other. So you got to remember all those ancillary filings out there, get them moved from the ones from old state to new state. Make sure everything's in alignment. You don't want a problem with an audit or an issue later where your businesses aren't lined up, right? So let's say you're in California, you move to being a Florida entity. Now you want to make sure that your tax accounts and everything else reflects the Florida entity, not the California entity on their name, right? And depending on what happens, whether it's a straight conversion, a merger, other things, your tax ID number might change. Certainly your state of formation is going to change. And, other things might change, such as, the EIN number. If you did a merger, you might have had one EIN. You might go to a new EIN. You would have that issue, right? So you want to get all this transferred over properly. It's not a incredibly complex process, despite what you heard today. You've got to figure out your situation. The biggest issue probably with it is just a paper chase. What do you file in each state? How do you harmonize them with each other? You're going to have one state's going to require one set of provisions, maybe in one order. Different state's going to require a different set of provisions. How do you make the two hook together nicely and work in unison? And then how do you make sure you don't have something fall through the cracks, right? How do you make sure all your accounts move over, all your contracts move over, and everything reporting-wise is clean? So maybe something a lot of you are crossing, maybe AB5 driven, may just be general business planning. Basically the same process either way. Over time, these strategies can be used potentially to minimize regulations, to potentially save taxes, and then also to make other desirable non-business outcomes. Maybe you just like living in one area better than another. So I hope that's helpful to you. Looking forward to reading your comments. Join me in the comments below. Always love reading those, learning from you. If there's specific combinations of states that folks are interested in, I might do a video about specific combinations of states or other follow-up. So thanks for tuning in, folks. Hope you subscribe, ring the bell for notifications if you're enjoying the content here. Give it a like so more people can see this video. It really helps. And then, again, if you can join me in the comments, I always love reading through that and interacting with you guys. Catch you soon.